what's up guys, going Joe here back in the video. Today's video is what if the Revenge cast Bucktail Island cast swap seasons? What if the Revenge Island cast and Bucktail Island swap seasons? This idea was by Joseph Willer, thank you, 1756. Thank you for a suggestion on my randomized cast action series, and let's get back to the video. Teams are so different now. Because the teams are so different, I decided to keep the original teams from Bucktail Island. So instead of like the order, because it's a random order, I have no way of knowing who would cross this finish line, so I'm just gonna say their teams are similar to what they were in the original season. Now in episode 1, they have to cut down the items, and to be honest, they cut down the poles. I think the teams come around similar time. The rats originally get there first, and they lost due to bad luck. So I think it's a similar case for Jasmine's group. Jasmine's group would arrive first, and then would lose to bad luck. Now, Amy would play as the victim here, as Jasmine is convinced with Sammy, but Amy is able to convince Rodney and Topher, since they believed her and Max. However, Scarlet wouldn't, but regardless, Amy has 4 votes to get rid of her sister Sammy. So I think Sammy's actually the first boot in this season, which she's eliminated. Now, this is getting their worm across the finish line, and to be honest, Amy would be gloating about winning this, getting her sister out. Jasmine would be annoyed at this and want Amy out as quick as possible. Leonard would try to use Wizard's magic like he does against the pig, and ultimately cost his team time. The rats are able to win the challenge due to the Leonard falling behind. Everyone targets Leonard for the same as we can. Episode 3. This is Ice Ice Babies, so they have to protect their statue. They have to get the flag. So to be honest, I think Max and Scarlet could easily come up with a strategy to get the flag. I think everybody else does decent, but I don't think they do that well. And Scarlet and Max would easily melt the flag. Since B could do it, I definitely think they can pull off the same thing. And the maggots lose. And I think Sean and Dave and Sky, they're kind of the 3 who's in charge. Sugar gets Ella to vote for herself, and while Beardo, he isn't exactly the best member on their team, I think they realize Sugar's been mean to Ella, and so they ultimately agree to vote for Sugar in this episode, since it's Sugar, like, it's a horrible thing as the last person, like, they wouldn't be thinking strategically, but I think they'd rather keep Ella, get rid of Sugar than getting rid of Beardo. Now, in episode 4 is the scavenger hunt, so to be honest, is where they get caught by the spiders. So they go, eventually everyone travels together, and Jasmine starts climbing up the tree. Amy gets caught by herself and Topher after hosting an event. Sean thinks that is happy about this, and Beardo ultimately gets captured first. Sean thinks he was taken by a zombie, which of course the rest of the team panic. Dave and Sky get caught together, which eventually leads Ella and Sean. Scarlet and Max get caught after Max trying to do his evil laugh. In the end, everyone gets there, it's very, very close, and out of the 2, Jasmine helps her team and so does Sean. I think the maggots win here since they have less people, on top of the fact they just travel better navigationally, and would just do a lot better when it comes to the actual challenge. Amy would get Rodney on her side. However, Scarlet would talk to Jasmine about getting Amy out, and she'd ultimately agree since she doesn't like her for getting rid of Sammy, and makes a deal saying with Jasmine that if she gets rid of Amy, you have to get rid of Max or me. And Scarlet and Jasmine convince Max to vote for Amy, since they point out that Amy's a villain and secretly evil, which taking his glory, which Max would actually really get rid of her. And Max is very easily to be convinced. Now, Amy and Rodney would want to get... Amy would know that Jasmine is too useful to dump at this point, so they actually would target Max. And this leaves Topher now. Topher is still in the game because he hasn't found... Chris hasn't dropped his phone for him. So he never finds his phone here. So to be honest, I think Topher does go for Amy though, because he does know that she's the least connected and probably the worst in terms of challenges, so he ultimately agrees to get rid of Amy. Now in episode 5, is where they have shooting challenge. So when it comes to the first episode, is pumping in the suits. It's Sean and Sky, Jasmine and Rodney. Rodney's doing the pumping. Ultimately, Sky and Sean were the first part of the challenge, so I think Rodney over pumps the suit. The shooter is Topher and Jasmine, Dave and Ella. I think Topher would surprisingly be pretty well in this challenge and ultimately get the points for his team. Dave and Ella do terrible since they're terrible shots. The maggots would actually lose the challenge here. And to be brutally honest, Sean and Sky and Dave all vote for Beardo. Now, episode 6 is the Yeti episode. So Lindsay still is the fashion contest, and Ella would be able to do that worm like they did, and the rats would do terrible. And this is when Max comes up with the plan to throw glitter all over the Yeti to make it look pretty. To be honest, this fails, and Lindsay still gets captured. To be honest, Ella would sing to the Yeti, helping her team win the challenge. And yeah, everyone clearly votes for Max here, since although Rodney is in love with Jasmine, she agreed that Max has to go here since he cost them the challenge and put their team in danger. And she agreed with Scarlett to get rid of Max. So they agree to all vote for Max in this episode. And episode 7 is where they have to get the statue. So, to be brutally honest, I feel like here the winner, the idol's still in place. That's worth noting as well. So when it comes to the statuette, Jasmine does pretty well here, and her and Sean are together. And eventually, they do make up after Sean sacrificed himself to save Jasmine. Now, to be honest, I think Scarlett would win the challenge with Jasmine since they'd have better navigation skills, on top of the fact they could just easily win the challenge for their team. And Sean, Sky, and Dave. Sean, and this is where Sky would reveal to Dave that she's a boyfriend. Dave would actually vote for himself. Sky and Sean would vote. Ella would actually vote Sky for hurting Dave's feelings, with Sky voting Dave, and Sean also voting Dave because he's Dave. So now we're at the merge, and can't believe Max lost today. Now, episode 8 is the go karts. So to be honest, I think Topher does okay here. Sean, Jasmine, Sean get call it together. Rodney does terrible. I think Scarlett wins immunity in this episode, and she chooses who to eliminate. And out of this group of people, she wouldn't really see any of these apart from these people, and she would choose to get rid of Sean since he's the biggest threat that's not immune, on top of the fact he just does very well in challenges, so she'd agree to get rid of Sean. In episode 9, where they have to make a blimp to try and stop Heather to get the prize money. Heather would still be stealing the prize money, however, because there's no Max, girl would never go crazy and ultimately wouldn't join her. To be honest, Topher and Rodney do terrible. And so now we'll be getting to the top for Heather to try and win the immunity. Now, to be honest, Scarlett, the Iron Balloon, I feel like nobody gets sabotaged here. And so Scarlett will win immunity to stop Heather. Now, I feel like Scarlett and Jasmine agree, and Jasmine doesn't like Scarlett, but ultimately getting rid of Sean would make a former Toxic Rats alliance. And they actually would target to get rid of Sky here, since she's the biggest threat not abused apart from them. So they'd agree to vote off Sky. Now, in episode 10 is... So this episode, the team has to go off and try and find... they have to try and find each other. Now, ultimately, this episode doesn't really... Is it the same when it comes down to navigational skills to try and find Gwen. Jasmine easily wins the challenge with her outdoor and skills, on top of the fact she'd have really good navigational skills. But I do think Sean could potentially win here. I ultimately do think that Jasmine wins the challenge. And Sky has been a lot closer to Sean than she has to Ella, since I think Sean and Sky are just naturally closer, so I do think Ella gets eliminated in this episode. So now we're at the merge, and Topher and Rodney are here, which is really cool. Episode 9. I feel like Topher's kind of chilling. So this is where they have to hit the go-karts, and Jasmine and Sean get caught together. I think in the race it's really close in the go-karts, but I do think Sky wins. So I don't think Scarlet does that well here, and I have the Topher and Rodney. And Sky would obviously choose to get rid of Jasmine over Sean since she's friends with him, and there's a couple in the game, which is a big threat. And episode 10 is where they have them win. And they have to do the obstacle course, and eventually it's where they have to stop Heather. Ultimately, this episode, Scarlet gets the hot air balloon. I think out of the three, Rodney doesn't do it, and I'm still for. So I think it's between Sky and Sean. I think Scarlet wins immunity because I think she would be able to realistically get to the top and stop Heather. I think they would agree she'd get Topher and Rodney to vote for Sky since she's the biggest threat that's not immune, and Sky and Sean are the last alliance, so they all vote her off. Episode 10 is where they have to. So, episode 11. The first part of the challenge is where they have to cook their disgusting the meals and eat them. Sean would win the challenge since I think he's the best eater, meaning the others have electric color. And Sean wins the challenge, meaning he wins immunity. So Topher, Rodney, and Sean would actually vote for Scarlet, but Scarlet has the immunity idol, meaning her vote's the one that counts. And she would choose to get rid of Rodney since he's the stronger of the two, and in this timeline, he's probably going to win most of the challenges. And while she wouldn't want to keep Topher, she kind of thinks Rodney's just a bigger threat overall out of the two since he's the most physical out of the two of them. Now, episode 12 is where they have to get is where they work on the maps and try to get the flower. And I feel like Topher and Sean may try to work together, but to be honest, I think Scarlet is too smart and just ultimately wins the challenge here. Now, in this episode between Sean and Topher, she'd obviously choose to get rid of Sean since he's the bigger threat. With Topher and Scarlet both in the finale, they have to fight each other. Topher realizing he can't actually fight Scarlet hand to hand, and eventually Sean would help him make a suit, and they each get winning endings. And this is it for the Total Drama Revenge of the Island cast. I thought it was cool to give Scarlet the idol since she was kind of that main antagonist. I originally wanted to give it to Max, but I thought it was more interesting if Scarlet had it. And now we get on to Total Drama, the Revenge cast being at Pocktail.
Now we get into Pocktail Island. Now there isn't an idol since I used it last season. I think in my next videos I might just spin a wheel to try to get it or randomize it to make it more interesting. So the first episode is you have to make a shelter. To be honest, Joe and Brick easily do this for their team, considering the fact they are pretty strong. Scott is still sabotaging his own team because he likes that strategy, even with it being a different season. I don't see Scott changing that. And Stacy gets voted off like the original for annoying her team. Again, this is the Greasy Pig episode. Scott would still sabotage slowing down his team and would still ultimately lose, since I think they do worse than the confused bears, even with a different animal. Everyone still targets Dakota like the original. Now, episode 3 is the balloons episode, and this is where they have to shoot balloons at each other. However, this episode, Scott gets hit on purpose, which means B, Sam, Dawn. Now, ultimately, we know how everybody else does, apart from Emery, who does terrible. I think Brooke, Joe, and Zoe do pretty well, and Zoe wins the challenge in All Stars, and I see her losing the B since I think he'd be outsmart Zoe, so I think the salmon win the challenge, which would annoy Scott, but he wouldn't be too annoyed since he would have quite a while to go for the merge. This means the maggots lose, and Joe and Brick still have respect for each other, and Amory doesn't like Zoe, but Mike, Zoe, and Cameron being a trio. Joe and Brick would tell Joe that as the leader, having a 3-person alliance would not be a good idea, and knowing that if they don't vote one of them, they'll be a biggest threat. To be honest, because Anne-Marie actually did decent and Cameron was probably the first out, I think Joe would agree that because she never has the realization that Anne-Maria is the weakest link in her team, she convinces Anne-Maria to vote for Cameron and makes a deal to get rid of Zoe, on top of the fact that Cameron is just easier to beat in a tiebreaker over Zoe. And I think even Anne-Maria would agree this, so the three vote for Anne-Maria. Vote for Cameron. Mike, Zoe, and Cameron vote for Anne-Maria since out of the three, uh, they know Joe is too useful to dump this early, and Brick is pretty strong, and Anne-Maria has just done leaks in the challenges. So Anne-Maria and Cameron have to face a tiebreaker, and I'm pretty sure Anne-Maria could beat Cameron just about any tiebreaker. So I think Cameron is actually eliminated in this episode. Now, episode 4 is Truth or Not, and to be honest, everyone does pretty well here until the final round, where I decided to do a random number generator to determine who would get the final round. So I got Anne-Maria and Dawn. Now, out of the two, I think this is pretty tough. But to be honest, I think Anne-Maria gets the win since she uses her can and literally can get knots out of anything. So I do think she would do a bit better than Dawn here, meaning the rats go to elimination. Scott would get everybody to vote for B and convinces Sam and Lightning since he's friends with them. And he'd also point out that Dawn and B are a big threat, and if Lightning wants to win, he needs to get rid of B. Sam is friends with Scott and ultimately agrees, so they targeted B in this episode. Now, in episode 5 is the Dueling Sticks episode, and to be honest, everyone gets out. Nobody returns in this version of the story. To be honest, it go like this. The first round, I decided to do the random number generator since it's random pairs and it's 1v1s. So, the Dueling Sticks, the first round is Mike versus Sam, and Mike easily wins since he doesn't have to use his personality, and I feel like Mike actually does better. Next up is Brick versus Scott, and Brick easily beats Scott, since Scott would be throwing, but even still would make it more believable that he wouldn't be able to beat Brick. Joe versus Lightning, and this is pretty tough, but I give the win to Joe since she is pretty strong, and I feel like Lightning would probably lose here since I think Joe would ultimately win the challenge. It's between Dawn and Zoe, and I think Zoe would actually get the point here, meaning there's 4 points to the confused bears. I did the random number generator for Anne-Maria, and I actually got Dawn in this episode, so I think Dawn ultimately loses, meaning that's 5 points to the confused bears, meaning they win the challenge. Scott could convince Lightning and Sam to vote off Dawn, since in this episode she did the worst, and she cost her team the loss, which is more believable for him to pull this off. Dawn would try to get rid of Scott, but is unsuccessful. Episode 6, Momo Monkey. So, the original Lightning would go in the vending machine to try and get protein and ultimately get a banana. Now, in this episode, Brick and Joe both navigate their team to win the challenge, and ultimately, Lightning eats the banana, causing his team to lose. Scott would get Lightning and Sam, and he'd ultimately get Lightning to vote for Sam, since Lightning doesn't like Sam, and he thinks Lightning's easy to manipulate, and now Scott's going to actually try to win challenges. Since he doesn't have the idol in this version, since in the original, if he lost again on the same team, he probably would have got rid of Lightning. Now, in episode 7, This is the Pit. Scott and Lightning do pretty okay here. Ultimately, everyone calls the wrong exit, like Kincannon, and Chris calls everyone a bunch of idiots. Joe and Scott still swap teams, since I don't think that changes as a result. Now, episode 8 is where they have to carry the babies across. I think Joe and Lightning do pretty well here. Scott would still be trying to sabotage his own team in this episode. And Anne-Maria would realize that Mike has veto. Ultimately, Joe and Lightning cross the finish line first, which means Maggot Bears lose the challenge. Brick and Anne-Maria would actually agree to get rid of Mike or Zoe. And Scott would actually agree with this since, again, he has no real reason to not go for this since he knows that there's a couple in the game. And he points out that Mike and Zoe are huge talent threats. However, Anne-Maria asks him to keep Mike over Zoe since she has got close to Mike, and while she does feel bad about the veto drama, and Mike never reveals his old personalities, she still thinks Vito is who Mike truly is. So they all target Zoe, who's obviously the biggest threat, and Zoe gets eliminated in this episode. Now we're at the merge, and yeah, our merge is different. So here we go. Now in episode 9, it's the puking episode. They have to all have to puke. Lightning wins the challenge since he can stomach it, and Joe and Brick are pretty close. I think Scott ultimately doesn't do that well here, and Lightning gets through the first part of the challenge by winning immunity by trying to find everyone. Mike and Emery are hiding in the trees, with Scott obviously hiding as well. Joe and Brick are hiding, however, I don't think Lightning could really find anyone in this episode. So Scott starts sabotaging people to try and get them to get called out. Joe and Brick both fall out the tree and they get caught. Emery and Mike get caught, which I think now Scott wins immunity since I think he does the best out of everyone that's here. Now in the Eat Puke challenge, I think it's between Joe and Brick. And to be honest, Joe and Brick both win the challenge, and I think they could tie each other. Now Scott ate dirt, so I think he wins the first part of the challenge. Everyone's hiding, and Scott calls out Lightning since Lightning has a very bad hiding spot. Emery and Mike are hiding in a tree. Brick and Joe would be hiding, however, I think Scott can find Mike and Emery before them. So between Joe and Brick, I think it's close, but I think Joe would have a little bit better hiding spot than Brick, so I think Scott would actually be able to call him out, meaning Joe wins immunity. However, Scott would want Brick out, and Joe would agree since she doesn't like him. And Brick would vote for Lightning, with Mike and Anne-Maria also voting for Lightning, and it comes down to a tie. And I think Lightning could beat Brick just about any tiebreaker, so I do think Brick gets eliminated in this episode since Mike and Anne-Maria aren't a couple. There's no reason for that to be the case. Episode 10 is where they have to stop the island from blowing up, which is still the challenge, but Scarlet isn't here this time, it's just Chris messing with everyone. Everyone goes by themselves, and Joe and Lightning go together, with Scott going by himself. To be honest, Mike and Anne-Maria make up here. Mike tells Anne-Maria about Smoke's personalities, as he wishes he told Zoe in the previous episode, which Anne-Maria finally understanding that Vito is a part of Mike. She apologizes for Mike and inconsistency and says to Mike she'll happily help him get with Zoe and won't get in the way of their relationship, which Mike appreciates. Ultimately, Joe wins the challenge and she'd be able to tackle Joe and Lightning travel together. She would tell Lightning to punch the door down, and Lightning ultimately can do this. However, Joe would tackle Chris winning immunity. This would really infuriate Lightning. To be honest, Scott can convince Lightning, however, Mike and Anne-Maria are a duo, meaning these two vote for Mike, and the other two vote for Scott. Joe is the swing vote, and I think she goes for Scott of the two, since he seems more schemish. And in this episode, Mike and Anne-Maria are a duo. However, I think Joe would actually go, since in a tiebreaker, since she doesn't need any allies right now, and she just thinks winning challenges is the best thing. However, there isn't a double elimination here, since in this episode, it never happens in this episode, since nobody else gets eliminated. In episode 11 is the race, they have to race at the top of the alligators. Joe gets across pretty early on, and Lightning ends up falling into being chased by crocodiles. Mike and Anne-Maria will be traveling together, however, Joe and Lightning cross, with Joe crossing first and Lightning second. Between Mike and Anne-Maria, I think Mike would cross before Anne-Maria, so Anne-Maria would get eliminated in this episode since she would do the worst out of the three of them. Now, in episode 12, they have to make a challenge, but for the sake of the video, and we don't know what they would pick, I'm just going to stick to the same challenges that were in canon. So the first challenge would be the hurdles, and Joe does pretty well on Lightning, and Mike would change into Svetlana. Now, out of the three, I think Svetlana wins the first part, with Joe coming second and Lightning third, since I think Lightning ultimately does the worst of the three of them. Meaning Mike gets 3 points, Joe gets 2 points, and Lightning gets 1 point. So don't touch the floor. I feel like Joe would actually win this challenge, followed by Mike, and Lightning would end up falling over very early on. The final part is a talent contest, and to be honest, I really don't know who'd do the best here. However, if I had to guess, Mike wins the first part of the challenge, followed by Joe and Lightning. Because Lightning did the worst in this episode, so ultimately because Lightning has the least amount of points, Lightning is eliminated. Now, Mike and Joe both make the finale and they get random helpers, so Mike ends up getting Zoe, and Joe ends up getting a Lightning, who would be really annoyed at Joe and obviously wouldn't want to help her. Joe makes a deal with Lightning saying she'll split the prize money with him if he helps her, so he actually does. Mike finally tells Zoe about Smoke's personalities, that they get across the obstacle course, and Lightning carries Joe to the end. ultimately they each get winning endings for the. And with Mike, obviously, after crossing the finish line, he tells Zoe. If Joe wins, he tells her before the finish line, and they still get together. Joe obviously betrays the Lightning and doesn't give him any money. If she loses, then Lightning ultimately leaves Joe. If she wins, Joe doesn't give Lightning any money. So that is it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. This is the elimination order for the Botany Island season. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and that's What If talk. What If Cocktail and Revenge swap seasons. And yeah, peace and farewell.